In this video, I'm going to discuss how Priestley presents and develops the character of Eric Birling over the course of the play. I shall explore not only the way in which he is portrayed as a changed character by the end, but I shall also explain his dramatic function, i.e. how Priestley uses his character not only to add intrigue, tension and drama, but also how he uses him to communicate his preoccupations about society's ills and what he thought was necessary to change it for the better. Eric Birling is an extremely important and interesting character who often gets overlooked in analyses of the play in favour of characters who are more vocal and who have more time on stage. Eric is actually absent for the whole of the second act. A young man in his early 20s, he represents, along with his sister Sheila, the younger middle class, upon whom Priestley pinned all his hopes for peaceful social change and a more equitable society. Eric undergoes a radical transformation throughout the course of the play, from a boy who is irresponsible, immature, and unable to speak up for himself in any meaningful way, to a man who is not only full of remorse and willing to face up to his responsibilities at last, but who is also able to stand his ground with his overbearing parents and to resoundingly reject their worldview. In the first act, Priestley drops clues like jigsaw pieces about Eric that will be picked up later and put together when his role in Eva Smith's suicide comes to light. The introductory stage directions describe him as being half shy, half assertive. He clearly has things that he wants to say, but does not have the self-confidence to do so. He is a closed-off and mysterious character to whom Priestley gives very few lines at the start, and much of his character is to be inferred from his short and often truncated comments. At the beginning, he is clearly ill at ease and on the periphery of the family celebration. We can also see that he is drinking too much, as he guffaws loudly for no apparent reason. What he does say, or half says, gives the audience the impression that Eric is a young man with something to hide, and this makes him an intriguing character from the start. In an unguarded moment, he makes a comment about women being potty about clothes and starts to tell an anecdote, but abruptly stops as he realises he is about to give something away. Gerald also seems to touch a nerve when he jokes, unless Eric's been up to something. Eric's extreme reaction, "I don't think it's very funny," hints at his feelings of guilt for some misdemeanour that is, as yet, unknown to everyone else. Priestley uses his representation of Eric's relationship with his sister Sheila to show the audience his immaturity. When Sheila kisses Gerald after he gives her the engagement ring, Eric calls out, "Steady the buffs," a catchphrase which has come to mean keep calm or steady on chaps. Eric clearly finds this public display of affection uncomfortable and worthy of ridicule, in much the same way as a child would, which compels him to make fun of his sister. It is also, perhaps, a forewarning of his immature attitude towards relationships between men and women. He and Sheila also squabble at the start of the play and indulge in a game of tit for tat. When Sheila calls him out at the table for being squiffy, Mrs. Birling remonstrates with her for the language that she uses. Eric proceeds to get his own back by insinuating that she uses much worse, "If you think that's the best she can do," to which she retaliates with, "Don't be an ass, Eric." Later, in the third act, when she spills the beans to their mother about his drinking, he uses childish language to berate her. "You told her. Why, you little sneak." He is outraged that she has been telling tales to get him in trouble. We can put some of his immaturity down to the fact that he has not been allowed to grow up. His parents still treat him as though he is a child. Early on in the play, Mrs. Birling takes him aside, saying, "Eric, I want you a minute," presumably to have a word with him about his drunken behaviour at the table. She later describes him to the inspector using language which infantilises him, saying that he seems to be in an excitable, silly mood, and then, when the inspector quizzes her on whether he is used to drinking, she dismisses this out of hand by saying, "No, of course not. He's only a boy." Eric is also clearly in the shadow of his father. He has been brought into the family business, but his father does not appear to think much of him or to take him seriously. He puts him in his place in a very peremptory manner when Eric tries to participate in the inspector's interrogation. To Eric's question, "When was this, father?" he replies, "Just keep quiet, Eric, and don't get excited." Eric is in a no-win situation. He has clearly had a very different upbringing to that of his father, which his father's business success has enabled him to have. His father, who has got all of his education from the good hard school of experience, looks down on him for his public school and varsity education, which he has ironically provided for him. The way in which Eric cuts his father off with, "Well, we don't need to tell the inspector all about that, do we?" suggests that he has not covered himself with glory whilst there. Another indication, perhaps, of his immaturity and unwillingness to accept responsibility. Mr. Birling later accuses him of being spoilt. For all his immaturity and heavy drinking, though, Eric does show a glimmer of independent thought from the very beginning, as he questions his father, "What about war?" His reluctance to accept his father's reasoning when he says, "Yes, I know, but still," even if he is ultimately shouted down, is evidence of his unwillingness to blindly follow in the path of his elders. There is, of course, dramatic irony in this exchange. From the perspective of 1944, when the play was written, with one world war in living memory and another ongoing, the audience would have seen that Eric has a better understanding of the contemporary political situation than his father. His naivety with regard to business, seen as a flaw by his father, is actually what allows him to see the human side of the equation and to take a principled stance on Eva's dismissal from the family company. He sees Eva's treatment at the hands of his father from the inspector's perspective. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices, and I don't see why she should have been sacked just because she'd a bit more spirit than the others. You said yourself she was a good worker. I'd have let her stay. This is something that the slightly older and more seasoned capitalist Gerald is unable to do, as he agrees that Mr. Birling couldn't have done anything else. When we compare Priestley's presentation of both Eric and Gerald, we can see that Priestley perhaps felt there was only a small window of opportunity to change attitudes before those of the capitalist older generation became ingrained in the younger, and so enabled the cycle to be perpetuated. Unfortunately, Eric's principled stance is limited at the beginning of the play. His standpoint on the way in which the female workers are treated at the factory does not extend to his attitudes either towards women as sexual beings or towards his own actions in defrauding his father's company of £50, which would have been a considerable sum in 1912. He as good as admits to having coerced Eva into sleeping with him the first time. "Yes, I insisted, it seems. I'm not very clear about it, but afterwards she told me she didn't want me to go in, but that, well, I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty, and I threatened to make a row." He does exhibit remorse for his actions, though, when he exclaims, "And that's when it happened, and I didn't even remember. That's the hellish thing." In his defence of his continued sexual relations with her after their first encounter, he contends, "Well, I'm old enough to be married, aren't I? And I'm not married, and I hate these fat old tarts round the town, the ones I see some of your respectable friends with." His coarse and derogatory language, and the way in which he says that he wasn't in love with her or anything, but I liked her, she was pretty and a good sport, is evidence of his attitude that he feels it is acceptable to exploit women for sexual gratification. With regard to his theft from the company, the way in which his first recourse was to stealing money through collecting cash payments and not writing a receipt for them, rather than try to find a legal way of giving Evas some money, is also an indication of his impetuousness and his lack of principle and maturity at that point in the story. Eric has found his voice by the end of the play, and is able to tell both Mr. and Mrs. Birling that he feels they have failed him as parents. When Mr. Birling asks why Eric didn't tell him about the trouble he was in, he retorts, "Because you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. That's why." Whilst it could be argued that by saying this, Eric is not accepting total responsibility for the theft by shifting the blame for his behaviour onto his father, what it does reveal is that Eric feels alienated by his parents and that he is no longer prepared to suffer in silence and be sidelined by them. The revelation that Mrs. Birling has been instrumental, not only in the death of Evas Smith, but also in that of his unborn child, finally allows him to stand up to her. Then, "You killed her. She came to you to protect me, and you turned her away. Yes, and you killed her, and the child she'd have had too. My child, your own grandchild. You killed them both. Damn you, damn you." The disjointed nature of his thoughts, caused by extreme emotion and the way in which they build to a crescendo, creates the highest moment of drama in the play, as he accuses his mother of effectively murdering both Eva and his child. The way in which he, almost threatening her, tells her, "You don't understand anything, you never did, you never even tried, you," reveals his resentment and frustration at being infantilized and not listened to, rather than nurtured. There is a real sense that Eric feels, in this moment of outburst, that he doesn't have that much of a parental relationship to jeopardize by speaking out in this way. Ironically, Eric's being forced to confess to his crimes has an oddly freeing effect on him. By admitting his responsibility, he becomes a lot more confident in the way he speaks, and he asserts his opinions strongly. When Mr. Birling tries to silence him so that Gerald won't find out about the stolen money, he retorts, "I don't care, let him know. The money's not the important thing. It's what happened to the girl and what we all did to her that matters. And I still feel the same about it, and that's why I don't feel like sitting down and having a nice cosy talk." He is also not afraid to tell his parents what he thinks of them. When Mrs. Birling tells him that she is ashamed of him, Eric responds, "Well, I don't blame you. But don't forget, I'm ashamed of you as well. Yes, both of you." This is an indication that he is no longer willing to show respect to his elders purely because it is expected of him, and that he is prepared to challenge them and make judgment on their actions. He is putting the inspectors, and therefore Priestley's, philosophy into practice by embracing the idea of collective responsibility. Eric and Sheila's relationship has also come a long way since the beginning of the play. By the end, they have put their petty differences and sibling rivalry aside, putting up a united front against their parents as they refuse to go back to how everything was before. When Sheila tells her mother, "All right, but it doesn't make any real difference, you know," and Mrs. Birling counters with, "Of course it does," Eric immediately backs Sheila up with, "No, Sheila's right, it doesn't." Later, when Sheila tells her parents that the way in which they are talking frightens her, Eric stands with her saying, "And I agree with Sheila. It frightens me too." So, what is Eric's dramatic function? If we look at the play as an allegory, we can see that as a character he symbolises just one facet of the upper middle class, represented by the Birling family as a whole. He demonstrates the way in which upper-class males treated vulnerable working-class females as faceless objects to be exploited to satisfy their sexual urges. But he is also part of the younger generation at the same time as the heir to the Birling business empire, if, of course, Gerald Croft doesn't get there first. As such, he can either go the way of his father and become a hardened capitalist to run the business in such a way as to maximise his profits at the expense of his workforce, or he can take the inspector's more socialist approach to pay workers fairly and protect their rights. The way in which Eric, as well as Sheila, supports the inspector instead of siding with his family throughout the play, suggests that Priestley feels it is possible to effect social change peacefully by educating those with whom the balance of power lies. When the inspector has left, it is up to Eric and Sheila to take on his role and become the mouthpiece of his ideas. Eric is able to see everyone's involvement as part of a chain of events, as he says, and it doesn't alter the fact that we all helped to kill her. Eric is also at the centre of arguably the play's most dramatic moment, where we realise that he is in fact the father of Eva Smith's child. In terms of the way in which the play is structured, the first 3 confessionals are told in the order in which they happen. Mr. Birling is first to have dealings with Eva Smith. Her dismissal from the factory leads her to take a job at Millward's, where she then loses that job because of Sheila's bad temper and jealousy. Her inability to get further employment leads her to embark on the life of a prostitute at the Palace Theatre bar, where she meets Gerald Croft. So far, so chronological. Eric's confession about his role in Eva Smith's suicide should come next chronologically. It is, however, switched with Mrs. Birling's interrogation by the inspector, so the family find out that she was pregnant and needed charitable aid before they find out who was responsible. Not only does Priestley keep us waiting to finally get an explanation of Eric's seemingly erratic behaviour, his excess drinking, his jumpiness, and those unfinished sentences, but it also provides a coup de théâtre, or a sensational turn of events which is heavy on dramatic irony. The family may have been a bit slow on the uptake, but for the audience, Eric's being responsible for Eva's pregnancy has been inevitable since the middle of the second act. Priestley places Eric's involvement at the end to expose the rank hypocrisy and blind prejudice which he saw in the upper middle classes, and which is embodied at its starkest in the character of Mrs. Birling. When Mrs. Birling is ignorant of the identity of the father, her condemnation is damning. "I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have. If, as she said, he didn't belong to her class, and was some drunken young idler, then that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him." But when she finds out it is in fact Eric, she says, "I don't believe it. I won't believe it." As Eric says to her when he returns, bitterly, "You haven't made it any easier for me, have you, Mother?" Eric also needs to be the final link in the chain in order to demonstrate Priestley's belief in the most dramatic way possible that we are all one community, and that when we harm someone else, however minor we think it is, we effectively harm ourselves. Through her callous actions, Mrs. Birling has unwittingly played a part in the death of her own grandchild and has caused irreparable damage to the relationship with her own son. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.